Hello and welcome back, everybody. We are trucking along and moving on in today's class to another branch of psychology called personality psychology. When we talk about personality psychology, what we're going to see is a lot of overlap between what they study and what social psychologists study, because both personality psychologists and social psychologists are trying to explain behavior. However, what makes personality psychologists differ from social psychologists is they believe that sometimes internal mechanisms, characteristics within a person, are what's causing a person's behavior, not the social situation. And it's not that personality psychologists and social psychologists strongly disagree with each other. In fact, very often they recognize that there's an interaction between the social environment and the person that causes us to behave. But personality psychologists, again, focus on behavioral trends that are consistent within the individual. And when studying this, they ask a number of questions. One of the things they ask is how we actually can describe people. So the terms that we can come up with, the concepts that we can use to better convey what a person's like. Another question they ask is, well, what causes these consistencies? If we see somebody doing something over and over again, the assumption is that something had to have happened or something had to kind of push that person in a specific direction. And the last thing we can look at is the idea that when a behavior is emerging, when a specific characteristic pops up with an individual, that this is going to have an impact on them, not only in the moment, but theoretically throughout their life. So we can talk about research that looks at, say, a specific personality type and how it impacts happiness over the lifespan, or aging, or risks of death. When we talk about these ideas, we can see that personality is a very diverse field. When we look at this particular field, we're assuming, again, that when we're talking about what's causing you to behave in a specific way, we can indeed find consistency. And that consistency is something that you can not only control, but is somehow a part of you, not just the social situation. When we're talking about personality, though, we first usually have to start with one of the first people to actually explore this topic on his own and how he understood what made us a person. This particular individual is somebody that we've danced around a couple times in class thus far. His name is Sigmund Freud. Now, Sigmund Freud actually did research in both the fields of personality and the field of clinical psychology, which we'll be talking about after personality. And in his prominent theory about what made us tick, called the psychodynamic theory, we can see an explanation for not only what makes normal people behave, what causes each of us to have individual differences, but what creates the abnormal as well. His psychodynamic theory is based on the assumption that when we look at an individual, look at who you are, what makes you tick, what makes you a specific individual, is what's going on inside of you. In essence, the internal forces that you have pushing you in different directions, causing you to pursue different things, avoid other things, is what's the essence of your personality and the essence of, theoretically, abnormal personality that you might display. This idea of Freud's was not necessarily his own, but he pushed it to a new level because he introduced a major force that seemed to kind of fly in the face of lots of current psychologists. And this idea was this concept of separating us into two different components called the conscious and the unconscious. He thought when we talked about forces, yes, what we're aware of, what we desire, what we want can indeed impact us. But in addition to that, we had unconscious forces, thoughts, experiences, desires, and wants that we weren't even aware of. We didn't even know were affecting us in any situation or in any shape or form. But nonetheless, even though we weren't aware of them, they were strongly impacting all the different things that we were doing on a regular basis. This idea of the unconscious made Freud very, very popular, but it also caused a lot of people to be skeptical of his theory because there wasn't a lot of research in his idea. Nonetheless, this idea of the conscious and unconscious was the first major step in Freud's psychodynamic theory. When asked to describe where these unconscious and conscious forces came from, Freud argued or articulated that they were coming from a number of different locations. One of the places they came from was our current environment. What we saw, what we wanted, what we needed did indeed play a role in who we actually were. But, more importantly, according to Freud, our past played a major role in who we were and what we were doing. Those past traumatic experience, past desires, past things that we still haven't let down are the things that drive us to do some of those peculiar behaviors that we oftentimes have no explanation for in the moment. So if you've ever caught yourself getting in a fight with a friend or a neighbor that you know you shouldn't fight with, Freud would argue that that's a prominent part of your unconscious, going into something from your past or some desire that you had that's acting up, that's trying to somehow quell a desire or a need that you have. This idea of Freud's also was introduced when we talked about where abnormal psychology came from, as we mentioned earlier. In essence, he said, if these traumas are so strong, not only will people do things that they can't necessarily explain, but they can do things that become extremely harmful to the individual. So they put them at a major disadvantage and cause behaviors that are so unhealthy that we qualify them as abnormal. In addition to this, Freud said that oftentimes when we look at individuals, what we see is this kind of pent-up individual. And this pent-up individual is looking to feed these desires, these needs that they have in order to feel better. And he said when a person actually acts on these desires, he or she can experience something called catharsis, some type of a release of tension that's built up because of these unconscious and conscious desires that a person has. So in essence, we've got things from our past, things from our current environment, pushing and pulling us in different directions. Some of them we're aware of, some of them we're not aware of. If it's really bad, we can create abnormal behaviors. Most of the time, all we're doing is just acting in ways to kind of relieve the tension, make us feel better. But there's more to this theory than just that. In addition to having these ideas of conscious and unconscious, Freud argued that we actually had different types of individuals or different components to us that was really the essence of this conscious and unconscious. Freud argued that within each of us we have something called the ego, the thing that we're completely aware of. The self we describe ourselves as, the things that we know we've done in the past or intend to do, is what most people think of as kind of being the major part of who we are. But according to Freud, this ego is merely a negotiator, something that we can see on the surface, but instead of it being the dominant thing, it's a small part of the whole person. Instead, the major parts of who a person is operated on both by the id and something called the superego. The id, he argued, which is a major component of all of us, is the part of each of us that tries to pursue major drives, major wants and needs that are only benefiting the individual themselves. So your sexual drives, your need for power, your need for control, your need for fame, all of these things that theoretically a number of us have but don't want to admit are things that our id is constantly pursuing on a regular basis. But while we pursue these things, we've got another part to our unconscious called the superego. It doesn't operate on benefiting us, but instead operates on benefiting society. And more importantly, operates on doing what's right. What Freud argued is that this particular part of who we are has to be formed in the environment. We have to learn what's right. We have to learn what we should want to do. And once we do that, our superego can start competing with the id. More often than not, we need to find a way to balance these two, because very rarely do the superego and id want the exact same thing. So instead, we display elaborate behaviors, random things that don't really make both sides happy, but both sides a little more content. And we come up with some rationalization for how we do it by using this ego. This was the major idea that Freud presented in his psychodynamic approach. He also introduced this notion that when a person had too many hostilities, when abnormal behavior started becoming a problem, then we should use the psychodynamic approach to help cure these individuals. The way we do this was to take this unconscious that he was talking about, both the desires and the kind of the things that we've pushed to the back of our heads, and find a way to bring it up. To do this, he introduced a number of specific techniques that he argued you could do as a therapist or just as any individual. His most popular technique was something he called psychoanalysis, where a client, patient, interacted with somebody who was considered a therapist or a doctor, somebody like himself that knew about this psychodynamic theory and was able to help navigate a person into the different levels of their psyche. In psychoanalysis, Freud would have people tell him stories or talk to him about different situations and desires. And he would look for those things that people were hiding or those things that caused discomfort and assume that that was what was this true source of a person's problem, the major conflict that they were trying to deal with. Psychoanalysis took a lot of time, a lot of money, and more often than not, Freud argued that people were never really cured of their unconscious desires once they'd formed them. But in his reports, in his research, he went on to argue that if psychoanalysis was provided correctly, it could help people with a number of different disorders and problems that they were experiencing. Another technique that he developed over the years was something called free association. In free association, what you do is present somebody with a word or a term and have them just shoot out as many words as they can in kind of a salad, in a sense. So if I would say the word tree, the first word that might pop to your head is the word bark. And then bark might bring up the word dog. Dog might bring up the word hair, comb, brush, and you continue on and on and on until you found something that you were uncomfortable with. When you thought this particular activity was maybe silly, or you didn't want to do it anymore. And Freud thought that that particular reaction, that response, was very telling. That what was going on there was that your unconscious had led you in a direction and then realized that it didn't want to continue going there. So you would stop it. And that attempt to stop, Freud argued, was what we wanted to push through, because that was the way to get at some of those unconscious desires that were causing the abnormal behaviors that people were displaying. Another technique he introduced was something called dream interpretation. In fact, this was what made him exceptionally popular in the United States. Because what he argued, he didn't get much support for it in Europe, but in the States they loved it, was that if a person had a dream, what was actually going on most of the time was that their unconscious was subtly peeking out within the details of the dream. But he said to truly understand what the dream meant, we had to differentiate between two things. The first thing was something he called the manifest content, the actual details of the dream. So if you dreamed riding a bike up to the center of a city, and then jumping off the tallest hill of the city and flying around, Freud argued that this dream was simply what you manifested. But what was important with the dream was what it actually meant, what the symbols, the ideas embedded within the dream actually implied. And he said with this manifest content, often what we had was latent content, theoretical ideas that we can apply to those experiences. So flying wasn't just flying. It was maybe a need to release, a need to escape what we were in or encountering at that particular time. Riding a bike was not just a bike, but some major type of idea or mode of transportation. And in Freud's very popular book called The Interpretation of Dreams, he attempted to explain the latent content behind some of the more commonly dreamed ideas and concepts. Now, there's a lot of research that's shown that this particular idea is not really embedded in fact, but more just opinion and ideas that Freud created. But this idea, the interpretation of dreams, was what really sold Freud to the major population. Another thing that sold him was something he called Freudian slips. Freudian slips, he argued, were little slips of the tongues that were anything but unintentional. So if I were to say, welcome a friend to my house, and say, I'm so sad to see you're here, and then correct myself and say, I'm so happy, Freud argued that that mistake was not a mistake at all, but instead a momentary lapse where we were not preventing our unconscious from coming up and instead said what we truly desired or truly wanted. One final thing that Freud introduced that again made him exceptionally popular was his use of the concept of hypnosis. Freud by no means invented hypnosis, by no means developed hypnosis, but he was the first to assume and apply hypnosis to the notion that when we look at the unconscious, we might better access it through this particular transition in a level of consciousness. Nowadays, cognitive psychologists, social psychologists, and personality psychologists use hypnosis in a very, very different way. And what I'd like you to do is, if you can, pause this, go to the link again, the Discovering Psychology series, go to video 14, The Mind Hidden and Divided, and go 11 minutes in and go to 18 minutes and 48 seconds. You'll see a very interesting video that discusses some of the current uses of hypnosis that we've had, even though, again, just like dream interpretation, many people have since rejected Freud's ideas of what hypnosis could actually be used for. After you're done with that, please move on to the next slide. Now, in addition to kind of coming up with very controversial ideas about the unconscious and the conscious, one last thing that put Freud really on a pedestal of the most, I guess, debated individuals ever to live was one of his last theories that he developed in his work. And this theory was based on what caused specific abnormal behaviors within so many of his patients. Freud had argued that traumas from our past, major experiences, were the source of most abnormal behavior. But when pushed to explain it, for many years he just neglected to argue what these traumas could theoretically be. But over time, Freud started to argue that maybe the majority of these traumas were sexual based. And he thought that most kids who displayed abnormal behaviors like depression or anxiety issues or smoking issues were probably doing them because of some traumatic sexual experience they had at a young age. When he proposed this, the entire psychological community was in an uproar. Essentially, Freud was implying, unbeknownst to him, that a huge percentage, maybe half the population, was being molested as young children. Because of the backlash, Freud quickly backed away from this particular idea, and later went on to argue that maybe what was going on here wasn't that people were being molested, but instead they had sexual desires that they were experiencing at young ages that just didn't happen to be met. And he later went on to argue that sexual entities or sexual desire could actually manifest itself in different ways throughout our lives. He argued that all of us, throughout our lives, from the moment of birth, are sexual beings. But our pursuit of sexual gratification, or our desire to pursue sexual gratification, which he called libido, came in different forms as we progressed from birth to adulthood. He argued when we look at young children, even though we don't think of them as sexual, definitely not in the way we think of adults as sexual, there are sexual drives that can impact them throughout their life. He argued the first stage, or the first sexual drive that individuals have, starts from birth and goes to about a year and a half, where children develop what he called an oral fixation, where they go through the oral stage of development. He said in this stage, children derive their sexual pleasure by having oral stimulation. In essence, being able to suck on things, chew on things, make sense of their world by putting things in their mouth was how they derived some type of sexual joy or pleasure. Right? This idea not only, Freud argued, gave us an explanation for the behavior of kids, but also explained why adults sometimes displayed abnormal oral behavior. Because he said if a child's needs were not met, if they didn't get to suck and chew on enough things, what can happen is they will fixate on these things later on. And he said when we look at people that are chain smokers, we look at people that eat too much, theoretically, this could be caused because they weren't allowed to have their libido sated, or they weren't allowed to kind of quell their desires when they were young children. And he said this particular problem, this cycle of needs and destructive behavior if the needs aren't met, continues after the oral stage. In the next stage, we go into the anal stage, where we focus a large amount of our sexual energy on the ability to control our bowel and bladder movements. For children, he argued, being able to pee and go poop in the right spot, or I guess to relieve ourselves in any way, was really, really important. In fact, he said if a child lost the ability to do this, or just couldn't learn to control their bowel movements, then this would manifest itself in abnormal behaviors later on. So, if you've ever seen somebody that you've described as anal, a common term used in the United States, you might not know that that description of somebody being very orderly, being very neat and organized, was actually something that came from Freud. When you're saying that, you're essentially implying that this person did not go to the bathroom correctly at a young age. An interesting little quirk that we've kind of forgotten along the years. For Freud, the next stage we went into, about 3 years of age, was something called the phallic stage. And this particular stage got Freud in a lot of hot water. In fact, it was probably one of the most controversial ideas that he presented in the field. Because what he argued was that at about age 3, boys and girls start to recognize that they have differences in genitalia. Namely, boys realize they have something called a penis, and girls lack that particular organ. And he argued this can have a very, very profound effect on both boys and girls. He thought that once a girl realizes that they do not have this penis, they will forever be damaged. They will forever suffer and be sad and jealous of males because of something he called penis envy. He also argued that once boys realize they have something that others don't have, they will become terrified that theoretically they could lose it. And their biggest concern is that one of the people in their family, namely their father, could be the one to remove it from them. Because in addition to having this recognition of differences between genitalia, he argued that most boys and girls recognize that they're supposed to pursue members of the opposite sex. And he said for boys, the main person that they want to pursue at that point in time is their mother. For girls, the main person they want to pursue at that point in time is their father. And this desire to pursue these individuals causes a lot of tension for both boys and girls because they realize their same-sex parent might find out, might be upset with them, which is why many movies have been made about this notion of children killing their parents or parents finding out about a child's affections for their mothers and killing the child. Freud thought these weren't just stories, but kind of reality emerging in movies. Because he thought this phallic stage, this area where focusing on the penis, the vagina, and all the differences between men and women, became exceptionally pronounced. Freud also went on to argue that at about age 6, these desires, these needs, these concerns became somewhat dormant, until by the time we reached puberty, and when these sexual interests and desires became what we typically think of as adults. Now, before you get worried about this, before you start getting very agitated or excited about this notion that all females are jealous of males or that all males worry about losing their penis, know that there is absolutely no substantial research to support any of Freud's theories. In fact, even though personality psychologists still today feel a need to talk about Freud's concepts, more often than not, psychologists loathe Sigmund Freud and some of the stuff that he's proven, or not really proven, but spoke about in his research. But when we look at Freud, we want to look at him as a whole before we go on to reject him. When we think about Freud and his impact, there are some things that we want to mention. Namely, the fact that some of his theories have definitely changed, but seem to have a major impact on our understanding to this day. One of the ideas that he introduced was this notion of the unconscious. Namely, the idea that who we are, what we could possibly be pursuing, might be something that we're completely unaware of. Or what we pursue might be because of something we can't even recognize within ourselves. Another idea that Freud introduced was this notion of sexual drive having some impact on who we were. Many psychologists before this had assumed this might be the case, but were very hesitant to make these statements. Freud's idea, introducing sexual desires, sexual needs into the conversation, was absolutely paramount in understanding the human condition. He also argued that when we try to do this to explain normal behavior, we can also explain the abnormal as well. When we look at what we can take from Freud, we can actually benefit from his, knowledge of, we see there's a couple things that do still have remnants in our current theories. His idea of having an unconscious is still something many psychologists look at today. We also agree that people are indeed very conflicted individuals. What you want, what you need, can oftentimes run into what you should do, what you think might benefit you, say, temporarily or for the long run. And these conflicting motives, what Freud argued in his research, do seem to manifest themselves in almost every situation we find ourselves in. In addition to this, we've also now come to believe that Freud's idea of childhood having an impact on our adult behaviors, who we are, does seem to be credible. Surprisingly, before Freud, very few therapists and researchers put much value on our childhood experiences. In fact, many people thought we could just take children, lock them away for many years, and bring them out when they're ready to become adults. Nowadays, we know those experiences we have, the environments we're in, can greatly shape who we are. We have to give Freud some credit for that particular notion. The last thing we do have to attribute to Freud is this notion that sex, again, does indeed impact us. Maybe not as much as Freud thought, but it does have some impact on our daily behaviors. In terms of where Freud was wrong, though, there are a number of things we do need to repeat. One of the things that's very important to understand is that Freud's concept of the unconscious was very different from our current concept of the unconscious. We have no substantial evidence that you have a tiny man inside of you or woman inside of you called the id, trying to convince you to pursue sexual gratification. There's no superego either. We also have no sense that most of your unconscious is dominated by sexual needs. Instead, now, we think of the subconscious or the unconscious operating on tiny little stimuli, environmental factors or memories or experiences that we can theoretically access, but don't necessarily attend to without really thinking about them. This transition to a new unconscious has actually led researchers to very often focus on using a term which I accidentally kind of embedded in that last sentence, called subconscious, where we can intentionally separate this basic idea of Freud's from the new concept of what we talked about when we're discussing the unconscious, or again, the subconscious. Another thing that we see with research about behavior and personality is that it's definitely not all about sex. Sex plays a role, but sex does not seem to be the dominant thing that's shaping our human behavior. And more importantly, psychosexual stages definitely do not seem to be something that impacts any of our human behavior. And what we've also need to talk about when we're talking about rejecting Freud is the fact that even though psychoanalysis is still used today, there is very, very small amounts of research to support the notion that abnormal behavior like depression or anxiety or anything else is a result of only traumatic experiences during childhood. Unconscious desires do not seem to be the primary source of almost every major disorder that we're going to be talking about later. So, even though Freud studied abnormal, it's still looked at by a number of people today. Many clinical psychologists have outright rejected Freud's association with their particular field. But we've gone very, very far since Freud. What I want to do now is just talk about some of the major figures and theories that have been introduced since Freud that have continued on with this personality conversation.